Welcome to Reflections with Amanda DeRocher, a New View Advice mini-sode series. Hey, beautiful soul. Welcome to Reflections. I'm Amanda DeRocher, and this is a New View Advice mini-sode series where I share stories and writings from my own healing journey. I am a survivor of sexual violence, and I share these stories each week because the hardest part for my healing journey was how lonely I felt. So I share these stories because my hope is that they help someone out there feel less alone. My intention is always, if one person feels less alone hearing these stories, it's worth putting it out there. So thank you for listening. Today I'm going to jump right into this week's story. And before I do, I did want to mention up front here that this story talks about suicide and sexual violence. So please take care of yourself. And with that, let's jump on into this week's story. That time I had survivor's guilt. I sat down to play the piano, and all I felt was guilt. I had always wanted to learn to play the piano, but for a long time, I did not have the capacity for new hobbies. Instead, my mind and body had been in survival mode. For 15 years, I lived with suicidal ideation, and now I didn't. I thought I would feel free, but instead, I was plagued by guilt. I had spent the last 6 years healing from sexual violence and the devastating impact it had on my life. I spent years running from and fighting the voices in my head. Some of these voices told me I was unworthy, my life was not worth living, and that I was the most horrible person. And other voices taunted me with flashbacks of the worst things I had survived. I hadn't realized how debilitating living with suicidal thoughts had been. I had been fighting a war, but I was fighting both sides. I was the one fighting for my life and also the one trying to take it. So when my suicidal thoughts left for good, after an unexpected but powerful meditation in my weekly yoga class, I felt as though I had been given a second chance. At first, when I was freed from these thoughts, I started to embrace life more fully. I danced down the sidewalk, I chatted with everyone I met. The once dreaded small talk was now an opportunity for me to connect with others. This is when I began playing the piano. At first, I would sit down every day with a smile on my face. I even finished a beginner's book for children where I learned to play songs from my youth. I was in awe that I got to enjoy life rather than dread it. But was this too good to be true? The more I began to question my new way of being, the more the initial joy I felt turned into something else, a nagging sense of guilt. As the weeks passed, I started to be consumed by thoughts of a girl I once knew. She had died by suicide several years earlier. I found myself sitting in my room and obsessively reading her obituary and the kind things people said about her. I hadn't seen her for years before her death, but I looked at pictures and saw a beautiful, kind young woman who was missed by so many. From her pictures, you'd never know she was struggling, but she was, just like I had been. She and I shared a similar story. Not only did we experience something so similar with how we were both raped, but we both struggled with thoughts of suicide. The only difference was that she had taken her own life, and I was still here. I felt so guilty for it. I felt like a soldier returning from war. I had barely survived, and now I was highly aware that not all survived to tell their own story. I returned a changed woman, but no one seemed to notice. No one else seemed to realize how many others were still in the middle of their own war and fighting for their own lives. I had come out the other side a free woman. I should have felt free and victorious, but instead I felt guilty. Why had I been given this second chance? Was it right for me to be happy and free while others still suffered? These questions plagued me with guilt. I knew I had been to hell and back and worked hard to be where I was. I gave my sweat, blood, and tears to be here. I deserved to feel happy. I deserved to feel free. But I felt guilty for being happy. I felt guilty when I smiled. I felt guilty when I laughed. I felt guilty when I played the piano. Anything positive left me with the feeling of guilt. I was finally happy, but I wouldn't allow myself that happiness for very long. No, I would punish myself with guilt and remind myself that others did not feel this way. Others had died. Others still suffered. I especially felt like I needed to hold on to the suffering and honor the girl who died. Something bound us together. I felt like I couldn't let her go. I felt like I had failed her. Was there something I could have done? I finally began to discuss how I was feeling in therapy. This was the first time I put the label survivor's guilt to how I was feeling. I felt guilty for surviving something that someone else didn't. But by talking about how I was feeling out loud to someone else, I also realized I wasn't honoring her by clinging to the suffering. I needed to let it go. She would have wanted me to be happy. So why was I still punishing myself? I felt like a criminal who should be locked up. I may have stopped punishing myself with suicidal thoughts, but I had found a new way to punish myself. Debilitating guilt. As I reflected on this survivor's guilt, I realized this guilt went deeper. I kept thinking about another question. Was I worthy of this second chance? My survivor's guilt was rooted in a deep feeling of unworthiness. This unworthiness felt like a deep shame for just existing, like my existence itself was shameful. I began hiking daily. Hiking was one of the few things that grounded me and connected me to my body at this time. I could no longer live in my head. I was terrified of what would happen if I got lost in my thoughts again. The suicidal thoughts never returned, but I lived with immense fear that they would. As I hiked, I began to allow myself to see the long-held reasons why I felt so unworthy. I felt unworthy because no one had been held responsible for the trauma that I experienced. I was now free, but justice had not been served. If I was truly worthy, wouldn't someone take responsibility for their actions? Instead, I held on to the belief that someone needed to be punished for what happened that night in the woods, and if no one else would take responsibility, then I would. I felt unworthy because I had never reported what happened to me. Was I responsible if those boys raped more girls? Was it fair of me to move on when I could be culpable for the hell others lived in? I was a coward. I had failed them. It was all my fault. I felt unworthy because I lived in a society that still victim blamed. I was a victim, not a perpetrator, but I feared society would somehow blame me in the way I had seen other victims blamed countless times before. If I punished myself first, would I keep myself from getting hurt again? If I knew I was the villain, would it hurt less when others eventually called me one? I felt unworthy because this was an experience never talked about with my family. I knew they all knew, but we never discussed it. I repeatedly tried to tell myself that it didn't matter, but I couldn't help but wonder why no one cared enough to reach out and offer help during my hardest times. Why had no one said they were sorry that I experienced something so horrible? Why had no one cared that I was suicidal even when I voiced it? Did it mean I didn't matter? As I continued hiking in nature every day, I also reflected on the young girl and so many survivors I knew who had experienced sexual violence. I found myself seeing clearly how I wanted them all to be happy and to no longer feel trapped by the past. Why was it so easy for me to see their beauty and light, but still so hard for me to see my own? I had found myself out of hell, but kept dragging myself back into hell every time I felt guilty and unworthy. Would I ever tell anyone else to continue sitting in hell just because others hadn't found their way out? No. I would tell them to take their new life, embrace their happiness, and spend time in the sun, because they deserved it. Over the following weeks, I began to forgive myself for the guilt I was carrying and for the long-held feelings of unworthiness. As I hiked daily, I saw that these beliefs were old stories. They were not true. It was time to let them go and move forward. During this time, I visited Mount Rushmore. As I reread the Constitution, I felt like I was reading one of the most famous lines for the first time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words of the Founding Fathers deeply resonated with me in that moment. My happiness was not guaranteed, but it was my choice to pursue it. I finally understood that I was worthy of my second chance, and I did not need to punish myself with guilt. I had to finally let go of the past so I could truly embrace a new future. I don't know where I'm going or why I've been gifted a second chance, but I do know that I am worthy of it. All I need to do is to keep following that inner voice that led me here. I choose life for myself and for the lives that were lost to sexual violence and its aftermath. The gift I can give those who have died is remembering life is a gift and worth living to the fullest. I still think of this young girl I once knew, especially when I play the piano. But instead of feeling guilty, I smile. Some days I feel as though she's playing right next to me and saying thank you for living for all of us. Thank you for listening to this week's story about survivor's guilt. I am very grateful for everyone who tunes in and listens to these stories. These are definitely the most vulnerable things I've ever shared on the internet. So thank you for listening. Before I wrap up, I just did want to mention the beautiful soul that I talk about in this story. I chose to keep her name private. I didn't use her name because I don't think her story of sexual violence is public. So in honor of her and her family, I decided not to use her name, but she has had a profound impact on me and my journey. I truly do feel like she's with me. And I just wanted to take a moment to honor her because I really felt like she was writing the story with me and that she really doesn't want me to feel so guilty. So for anyone out there who's struggling with survivor's guilt, I really do believe that our loved ones who pass on do not want us to hold on to the guilt. They truly do want us to move on and see life as the gift that it is. And I have found that that journey of recognizing life as a gift takes time. And I definitely don't feel that way every day as a survivor of trauma, but more and more I feel that gift of life and see life in a new way. But it's always one day at a time, I find, this human journey we're on. So thank you so much for listening. I do hope that somebody feels seen throughout this story. And if not, I hope somebody learned something, or it was just a story that made someone think. But thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the story, I invite you to give it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel on YouTube or follow me on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you next time. All my love.